Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you. Welcome to this February 8th, 2022 Brattleboro Democracy Forum meeting. I'm pleased to welcome tonight Tim Kipp and Nick Biddle, who will be talking about the despotic nature of the Supreme Court. Tim and Nick have been the backbone of the Brattleboro Democracy Forum since 2017, and it's been great to work with them, and it's great to be back here tonight with them. Nick is a retired professor of Latin American history and a Brattleboro resident since 2013. Tim Kipp is a retired teacher at BUHS, where he worked for 39 years, and he has been a political activist since the 1960s. After the presentation, we'll open things up for discussion. So Tim and Nick, I always look forward to hearing what you have to say. So let's hear what you have to say. Thanks so much for being here.
Something that Nick and I have been talking about for years. And the court, of course, has been paramount in the news in the last few years, and certainly during the Trump administration. So we thought we'd do a dive into the court. Contrary to historic myths, the Supreme Court is not a democratic institution. Throughout its history, the High Court, with few notable exceptions, the Warren Court in particular, has been a bulwark of protecting property rights over human rights, of indeed actually undermining democracy. In fact, when citizen agitation for rights arise, which it has many times in our history, the Supreme Court can typically be relied upon to suppress those democratic impulses. This presentation will explore the fundamental undemocratic nature of the Supreme Court, or as Jefferson called it, the despotic branch. A central question that I'm interested in is this. For over 230 years, the Supreme Court has fundamentally performed the role of protecting the same economic and political interests throughout our history. And why is that so? Nick and I have been talking about this, come up with a number of abiding, deep-seated reasons for this. I want to look a little bit at the economic and political imperatives of capitalism as a way of determining what the role of the court should be. We'll also look at class dimensions of the court. And lastly, I want to talk about the constitutional principle of federalism. These are examination points that are symbiotic, and they reinforce each other and augment both the nature and the operation of the court. Before I dive into that, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of judicial review. The founders were conflicted about the proper role of the Supreme Court under Article 3. Jefferson saw the court as the most aristocratic of branches and feared assigning too much power would make it despotic. Many founders, anti-federalists, felt that an unelected Supreme Court should should not have the power to nullify an act of Congress. In 1803, just that opposite happened. Under Chief Justice John Marshall, the concept of judicial review was fabricated, and I use that word deliberately. He in his wisdom gave or anointed the court with the power to override laws or actions of other branches. When in fact, there is nothing in the Constitution that gives the court the authority of judicial review. It was an edict, an invention of Marshall, and it has remained with us to this day. Defenders of judicial review in the past and the present argue that such authority was implied. Critics of judicial review, led by Jefferson, saw this power as a usurpation and a violation of the separation of powers and the checks and balances. In the letter to Abigail Adams, Jefferson wrote, quote, "If Marbury versus Madison judicial review decision be a sound one, then indeed our Constitution is a felo de se, or a suicide pact." And further quoting, the Constitution would be a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary. So if Marshall's basis for this interpretation was in fact tenuous, why was it so readily accepted by the majority? My answer to that is that, like so much of the Constitution, the elite founders had similar class interests, and a consensus was achieved by assumption. Assumption by these leaders that they, in the main, were serving the national interest. Just so happened that the national interest happened to coincide with their own personal interests. I'm reminded of what Franklin said towards the end of the Constitutional Convention. He only spoke a few times. His health wouldn't allow him to do otherwise. He said, as we were drawing to a close, he said, "We as a body should trust in our fallibility. Trust in our fallibility." Well, in fact, I think just the opposite happened. I think what the founders did was trust in their infallibility. So the judicial review became codified, and in many ways was turbocharged the power of the courts. Over the years, over 650 laws have been either partially or wholly nullified. As late as 2015, former President Jimmy Carter said that the United States was an oligarchy because of this misuse of judicial power, the judicial review powers. Let me now turn to the economic and political imperatives of capitalism and how that has shaped the functioning of the Supreme Court. As is well known, the Constitution is an economic as well as a political document. In addition to creating the structure of government, the Constitution was designed to advance economic development by promoting what I see as the mythological free enterprise system and the mythological laissez-faire system. And they're doing that by either empowering the government or disempowering the government, depending upon the circumstances and the whims or the needs of those elite leaders. The other areas where the Constitution had a responsibility was to protect private property and to protect profit. And it's interesting to see that if you look at the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments added to the Constitution in 1791, that over half of those Bill of Rights articles explicitly protect property. So a ruling class analysis argues that the alliance between government and capitalists is both necessary and symbiotic. Capitalists need government and need a collaboration support from all three branches of government. Or as Chomsky called it, we become the nanny state. Contrary to received orthodoxy, capitalism typically requires more government intervention, not less. Laissez-faire tells us that we should have hands-off, no government or little government regulation. Concomitant to that, during the Constitutional Convention, the debates about the Commerce Clause, such as regulation of commerce, taxation, and tariffs, received very little debate. The founders were in near unanimous agreement on the importance of the Commerce Clause and about the need for the new government to protect private enterprise, capital accumulation, and profit. And that fight was led by Alexander Hamilton. As such, the Commerce Clause to this day is the most adjudicated issue in the history of the Supreme Court, by far, in a way. So these gentlemen of property and standing the elite rulers happily designed a government to protect their economic interests in the grand name of national security, stability, and prosperity. It's interesting that never, there being a liberal or a conservative, there is no matter who is in charge, there is never ever a serious question about what the real function and the efficacy of capitalism. That's always an assumption. It's assumed that this is the best economic system, and therefore we should construct a government that will defend that. Thus, the Supreme Court is one of the most effective means of protecting the political and economic prerogatives of the elites. And so how does this manifest itself in terms of the history of the court? How has the court represented the political and economic interests of the elites? First, by protecting and expanding corporate power. This was most directly stated in 1886 with the Santa Clara decision, which wasn't really a Supreme Court decision. I don't have time to get into that, why that was so, but it became precedent that has been used ever since. That is giving corporations the same kinds of First Amendment rights, 14th Amendment rights, among others, that a person has. That therefore expanding the power of corporations within the political economy. Areas like, as we see today playing out, campaign finance, freedom of speech, freedom of religion have all been part of this corporate personhood principle. The most egregious of recent decisions, and Nick will be talking about this, is the 2010 Citizens United decision on unlimited corporate campaign funds, and a lot has been written about this. I mean, but fundamentally, what that case does is legalize political bribery. Another way that the courts have represented the interests of the elites has to do with promoting an anti-union ideology. The courts can be relied upon to be hostile to the rights of working class people to organize and to expand their opportunities. In about 1900 to the late 1930s, an era known as, it's so infamous, it's known as the Lochner era, where the Supreme Court consistently struck down economic regulations, wages, hours, working conditions, child labor. If you look at the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, what was intended to be a mechanism to control monopolies actually became a mechanism to control and to outlaw unions. In 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, which was the single most anti-union law in the history. It established the concept of the right to work. And since Taft-Hartley, courts and Republican administrations rights. Today, as a result, we have the lowest unionization rate in the industrialized world, 6%. About the high was about 35 or 36% in the 1950s. Another way that the courts have supported elite rights and undermined democracy had to do with outwardly and overtly being antagonistic towards progressive era labor protections, as I've mentioned, but also progressive laws under the New Deal. Look at the New Deal here for just a second. The National Labor Relations Act, Agricultural Adjustment Act were two very key pieces of legislation and bills that were passed that the courts overturned under judicial review. Their next step was going to be to go after Social Security and the collective bargaining rights, and that's when FDR decided he would play a heavy hand and try to change the number of people on the courts. It's known in conventional historiography as court packing, and it's described as a bold and brash power grab by by FDR. I think another way to look at this, I believe, is that it wasn't a power grab by the president. It was a power grab by the conservative Supreme Court, who was willing to nullify acts of Congress, acts of elected a body of officials. Remember, the court is not elected, they are appointed. And if you look at what FDR was attempting to do, he was attempting to expand democratic rights, not to contract them. Another area where the courts have supported elite interests and undermined democracy, in my view, is in then support of imperialist foreign policies and excessive military spending. After World War II, the U.S. constructed what became known as a permanent war economy, where we would spend, and this really started happening by 1947, we would spend the amount of dollars we would otherwise have spent during a wartime. Now, yes, we would go in and out of wars, but this was even when between the time of Korean War and Vietnam War, and to this day. So keep the military budget high, and certain segments of our society happy. To this day, about 45%, and it ranges from 45 to 55% of the discretionary U.S. budget goes to the military. That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. This is more than the next 13 countries combined. Military budget constitutes our budget constitutes 40% of the total world spending in the military. Or to put it in more ridiculous terms, currently we are spending $1 million per hour on the military, or you could say $2 billion per day. And think about that, and then think about the real social needs that we have in this society. You think about the poverty, you think about the alienation of the people without education. And throughout this time, and really after World War II, and since the Supreme Court has refused any challenges to war-making powers or to citizen petitions to stop the funding for wars. Another way that the Supreme Court acts on behalf of the elites is on how it upholds or regulations or deregulations. It will do either one in order to meet the needs of those who are most interested in their decisions. For instance, the courts have upheld subsidies, federal subsidies, our money for fossil fuel industry, for the arms industry, for corporate farming, and so forth. It has upheld a distorted tax system where the wealthy in this country pay less than any other wealthy people in the other developed world. We have created the highest level of income inequality in the developed world. That is not democracy. Those forces are not democratic. They undermine democracy. Under the concept of a constitutional concept called the delegation of legislative powers, the courts have afforded the legislature and the executive to have the authority to set regulations for their departments, such as OSHA or EPA, Occupational Health and Safety, or Environmental Protection Agency, that those agencies, those people within the agencies who have the expertise, are given a certain amount of latitude to run their departments. Well, what's happening now under the Roberts Court is that authority is being eroded. In order to weaken the role of government's control over regulation of corporations. I think a classic example was last month's decision for the court to turn down the COVID mandates for corporations. An interesting statistic is this: that from the year 2000 to 2020, the Supreme Court has ruled in cases in favor of corporate interest, 80 times 0. 80 times to 0. Another area whereby the court has supported the interest of the powerful and undermined democracy is the whole idea of privatization of the public sector. We have seen this going on certainly since the Reagan era, with the privatization of schools, of healthcare, of utilities, of segments of the military, and of course prisons and the like. In other areas that Nick will be talking about is the deregulation of campaign finance laws, and some other areas as well. The Roberts Court, in my view, is one of the most overtly ideological and politically motivated courts in the history of our country. In its desire to dismantle the administrative state, the court has upheld Trump's evisceration of the cabinet missions and authorities during those 4 years under the regime of Trump. In alliance with the Republican Party, which in some ways acts like a cult, this is a Machiavellian court, willing, in my view, to employ autocratic methods to achieve its ideological ends. Give you some specific examples of that. The idea of court stripping is a power that's been utilized in the last 5 years by the Roberts Court, and that's the idea. Court stripping is the idea is that we, and who is we, meaning members of the court or conservative elements within Congress, can we restrict where the courts can actually rule? But this is a very selective choice of what they want to restrict. For example, Roberts, before he was on the court, wrote extensively about how to limit the court's authority, and he targeted 2 primary important laws. One was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 to 56, and Roe versus Wade. So the idea of court stripping. So it depends on who is doing the stripping. Another area that's, I think, fascinating, and it played out yesterday in the Alabama decision by the Supreme Court to uphold voting restrictions, and that is called the shadow docket. The docket is what the agenda of the Supreme Court is, and there is the merits docket, and that's the one that's the most, that's the one we know about the most. And then there's another one that is newly named in the last 5 years called the shadow docket. And the shadow docket is really, it's a procedural decision, and it is having to do with emergency hearings. So when it's timely, when it's necessary to move fast, they can do procedural rulings that don't need hearings, they don't need testimony, they don't need written decisions. They're more of decrees. Well, it's interesting, and those procedural cases have always typically have been not for very substantive issues. Well, what happened under the Trump-Roberts Court, and it's still happening, is that they're using the shadow docket technique for substantive issues such as abortion, voting rights, and immigration issues. And you saw that play out under the Trump regime. For instance, this technique was used by the Trump-Roberts Court 41 times, as opposed to 8 times under Bush and Obama. So in four years, they used it 41 times. You can now add 42 because the decision just made yesterday, whereas only 8 times under Obama and Bush in 16 years. Another area where the courts have usurped power has to do with what is known as the Purcell Doctrine of 2006. And that says, and on the face of it, it's reasonable. And Roberts came up with this. I think it's reasonable, but how it's implemented is the problem. If there's any change in election law near the time of an election. Now, they don't define when that is. You cannot empower, the court cannot empower the legislature to, in fact, enact that new law. So it's a way to keep the voting process more stable and predictable. Problem is, and this is, Justice Sotomayor has said it, that Purcell is now being used to condone and preserve disenfranchisement. And the Purcell Doctrine was in fact invoked yesterday. That wasn't mentioned in the Times, but that's what it was. They stopped the attempt to expand the rights of voting to African Americans and other minorities in Alabama based upon this notion of the Purcell Doctrine of we need stability on the courts. Okay, I'll finish up with a discussion now of the concept of federalism. As we all know, the constitutional principle of dividing power among the states and the federal government. It's also articulated in Article 10 of the Bill of Rights. Throughout our history, federalism, the Supreme Court has used federalism, or AKA states' rights, to protect corporate property and to suppress people's rights. States' rights has become the clarion call first heard in the Civil War and heard prominently again during the Civil Rights Movement after World War II. So what is it has been manifest with this defense of federalism and states' rights? How did that express itself in our history? I'll give you a few examples and then I'll turn this all over to Nick. The idea of federalism and states' rights has been used in defense of slavery. The Dred Scott decision of 1857. The federalism has been used to undermine or destroy civil rights throughout our history since the Civil War. It undermined, it destroyed, it ended Black Reconstruction, one of the high marks of high watermarks of African American political history. It has supported the institution of Jim Crow. You look at the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896, codified segregation up until the 1950s. We have promoted, this court has promoted white supremacy through naturalization, immigration, and eugenics rulings. It has undermined the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments that were passed after the Civil War. It has supported involuntary sterilization, Buck versus Bell. It has supported the internment of Japanese Americans, 125,000 of them, under the Korematsu case of 1944. I did a review of some of the major immigration acts since 1790. There were 18 major acts having to do with should we limit or should we expand immigration rights? Well, 15 of those 18 since 1790 have contracted, had restricted immigration rights. We on the left are sometimes felt relieved because of during the Trump administration, their incompetence led them to be ineffectual in passing laws. But he was very effective in getting programs through, such as building the wall. Well, he didn't build the wall, but in many ways he did build a wall. It's just an invisible wall. If you look at immigration rates and during his tenure, that legal immigration was reduced by 40% under Trump. That's a pretty effective policy. Another area has to do with citizenship under naturalization. For 162 years, from 1790 to 1952, this government has supported the criterion for being a legal citizen of the United States as being free white person for 162 years. You have to be free, you have to be white person in order to qualify, with a number of exceptions. And the last few areas that I want to talk about is the notion of underfunding public education. This is an amazingly powerful tool for undermining democracy. We pay for public education through very regressive private property taxes, which local people can't afford. We spend less federal money in the United States on public education than any other advanced society. Other societies will give, we know about their rights to having college educations, for affordable college education. We can hardly get anybody to get a community college degree. We have eroded, this court has eroded the separation of church and state, and will be doing it again in my anticipation this year, having to do with funding parochial schools and federal money going to, or state monies going to private schools. Massive college debt is a result of these policies, $2 trillion. Okay, a couple of other areas where Nick will be following up on is the gerrymandering and voter suppression and campaign finance law. So the last couple of things I want to mention is that this court has also enabled people to own more guns. We have more guns in our society under the guise of the Second Amendment than any other society on earth. We are a heavily armed society under the DC versus Heller decision of 2008. And it has been used to defend private property, as it was during slave patrol times in the antebellum period of the US history. The last area, which could use many lectures on, is that the court has been very effective at weakening or destroying environmental protection laws. So let me conclude and hand it to Nick, that I believe that this court has aided and abetted and reflected interests that are not the broadest interests of American people. And that is that they are protecting the imperatives of an economic system, and that the principles of federalism, I think, are outdated, and they're used in very parochial ways in order to undermine people's rights in democracy. Let me just end with one paraphrase by Adam Cohen, whose latest book, The Supreme Inequality, is a wonderful piece that I would recommend. And this paraphrasing Cohen, he says, the Supreme Court has created one system to protect corporate interests and another to undermine protections for the poor and the middle class. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Yes, thanks, Tim.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Nick. I want to begin tonight with dark money and the extraordinary crusade by millionaires and billionaires during the last 50 years to overturn and reverse the framework of government established in the New Deal, extending from the 1930s to the 1970s. Prior to that time, from 1800 to the 1930s, as Tim eloquently underscored, the court persistently sided with business interests over people's interests, usually elevating interests into rights, as in the rights of property over the rights of
people.
Prominent examples are slavery over freedom, segregation over desegregation, child labor over child protection, 16-hour workdays over the 8-hour day, and so on. By the late 1930s, the court tilted to support for the framework of a New Deal. And the framework included business regulation, graduated progressive income tax, and expanding equal opportunity. Hallmarks of the New Deal: and the era that followed it include Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, and Roe v. Wade. As many of us on this Zoom session remember, the 1960s into the early 70s were raucous, fierce, and turbulent times. Racially motivated church bombings, daily body counts from Vietnam, Black Panthers carrying weapons in the streets, FBI spies, Woodstock, and Watergate. Very serious times. The rich did not enjoy it, and they gathered their forces for a powerful reaction, a veritable crusade against liberals, lefties, and the democratic social structures that enabled them. The first and most important eruption of right-wing backlash came with the 1971 Lewis Powell memo and its most important conclusion, which is about the Supreme Court. Powell said, under our constitutional system, especially with an activist-minded Supreme Court, the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change. On that injunction, a massive wave of corporate wealth began assembling instruments of action against the status quo. They did so recognizing and utilizing the aspects of the Supreme Court that drove Lewis Powell to his conclusion. Those aspects combine elements of race, gender, and class with the mechanical formation and function of the court itself. Let's start with race, class, and gender. From 1800 to 1990, 106 of the total 113 Supreme Court judges through those years were white men, which is to say 94% of the Supreme Court judges have been white men. From a social perspective, social class perspective, over 90 of those 113 judges were trained in corporate law and either practiced or taught corporate law, which is to say their professional predilections ran to the benefit of wealth over commonwealth. And whether or not these men were born into wealth, they aspired to its entitlements. Formatively, we have to look at how Supreme Court justices arrive in their position. Presidents nominate them, and presidents are the heads of their particular political party. For a comparatively short period of time through the 1950s into the 1970s, nominees usually garnered bipartisan support from Congress. This having been the period of widespread consensus in politics around the New Deal framework. Historians have called this the liberal consensus. Lewis Powell's memo amounted to a deep broadside into and against that consensus. Through recent decades, every Supreme Court nominee so-called wins their nomination on the basis of strict party line votes and partisan promotion. Consequently, Supreme Court justices are political agents picked, nominated, and seated as political activists, even as they promise objectivity and nonpartisanship in the nominating process. Of particular interest and little considered in the general population is that most Supreme Court justices have little or no experience as judges. In a recent article, New York Times columnist Jamel Bowie pointed out that less than 25% of the justices in the court's history have had a substantive judicial experience before joining the court, which he defined as 10 years or more on a bench. More than 1/3 of the Supreme Court's justices were never, ever judges before they became the supreme judges of the land. This factor adds significant weight to the political function of the Supreme Court's justices. They are not picked for their judicial talents. They are picked for their political attributes. And once they are on the court, they're there for life, with no election or judicial check or balance, except theoretically impeachment. But that occurred only once in history, in 1803, against Judge Samuel Chase, and the impeachment failed. In short, the Supreme Court is supremely political and equally supremely unaccountable. Fully aware of these considerations, Lewis Powell and the billionaire class he enlisted to his cause in the early 70s began to mount a sophisticated long-term strategy to upend New Deal laws, New Deal values, and culture. Quickly called the Campaign for the Courts, one freshly minted organization described its purpose as, quote, molding a new jurisprudence, one that would, quote, make the protection and enhancement of corporate profits and private wealth the cornerstones of our legal system. As momentum toward that outcome advanced, one individual stands out as the quarterback of the movement, its pivotal figure and most effective manager. And his name is Charles Koch. It is nearly impossible to overstate the long arm of Koch's nefarious strategy, which, while highly focused on law and the courts, in keeping with the Powell memo, seeks a much larger context to put democracy in chains, as the historian Nancy McLean characterizes it. From the early 1970s into the 2000s, through his expenditures, first of tens, and then of hundreds of millions of dollars annually, Koch has built an array of think tanks, advocacy groups, public policy institutes, professional societies, and organizations that has become a literal proxy army of activists engaged, first and foremost, in the reconfiguration of American society from a democratic republic into a confederation of states ruled by corporate libertarianism. In a path-breaking book called Dark Money, Jane Mayer demonstrates the content of the proxy army graphically. In the front and back covers of the book, she names 64 501c4s and 63 501c3 organizations. Here's a copy of her graph of the front side, or that is the book, and that's how she does it. Wonderful to read through. They include organizations we know, and many of which you've never heard of, or I haven't. And they are, what she drew from are tax records from 2009 to 2013. And so here are the 501c4s, a total of $485 million. Some of the organizations that you've heard of: for the Americans for Prosperity. One you haven't heard of, Generation Opportunity. They got $15 million. Then there's the Concerned Women for America, 11 million. And here's one you know, the National Rifle Association. On the other side, 501c3s, who get less money, they only get 88 million. Big names, you know, Heritage Foundation, 25 million. American Enterprise Institute, 2 million. One you may not have heard, but I'm going to talk about, the American Legislative Executive Council, or I mean Exchange Council, excuse me, American Legislative Exchange Council, Here's one you never heard of: Fraser Institute, Research Foundation, Action Institute. As Nancy McLean puts it, Koch's proxy army operates on more fronts through more ostensibly separate organizations than ordinary mortals can easily follow. And several writers have observed how slowly the true nature of the Koch network has risen into public awareness. Koch has tried throughout to remain in the background, to seek no publicity, to expose no intention. A participant in a conference Koch held in the year 2000 reported Koch's favorite aphorism as being, quote, "The whale that comes to the surface gets harpooned." Jane Mayer, in her book and in all of her work, deserves lots of credit for bringing the Koch whale to the surface. First, in an article, also in year 2000, about his network. Since that time, Koch's stranglehold on the right-wing movement that has rocked America and spits fire and fury among us today has been Loctite. In fact, observers like McLean and Mayer have noted that the original moral foundation of Koch's activism, a type of Spencerian libertarianism, has morphed through the accrued impact of his largesse to have dropped the nicety of the ideology that supports each individual's right to go to hell in their own way. That freedom, shall we say, is no longer permitted in the Kochtopus, as his network or proxy army has been called. There is only one kind of freedom permitted in his scheme: corporate freedom. And with that change in his outlook in the early 2000s came his impatience with honesty. Consequently, while in the last decades of the 20th century, Koch worked straightforwardly to enact the unfetterment of government on corporations in the spirit of Ronald Reagan's famous campaign slogan that, quote, "Government isn't the solution, government is the problem." Since the turn of the century, Koch and his minion have been zealously declaiming the coercion of government while using their hold on the tools of government to coerce the institutionalization of their version of, quote, free market, of the free market or free market dominance, which amounts for all of us to corporate autarky. And so we arrive to today's Supreme Court. A decade after the Powell memo, a Yale law student recent graduate named Michael Horowitz, who had been employed by Richard Mellon Scaife, one of Koch's co-billionaire conspirators, wrote his own memo, a la Powell's memo. In it, he identified conservative public interest law firms as, quote, mere conduits by which image-conscious firms laundered money to appear to be pursuing public interest objectives. But that ruse was too evident and counterproductive to the success of repealing, for instance, environmental regulations or safeguard for victims of corporate malfeasance. Horowitz argued that, quote, it is critical that the conservative movement seek out and find clients other than large corporations and corporate interests in order to make itself intellectually respectable. Though protecting profitability is and was the fundamental goal, Horowitz urged the fledgling movement to seek a genuine right-wing revolution in the high-end legal profession, and the judiciary. The movement needed to create, in his words, a bar comprised of law review editors, former law clerks, and in no small part of alumni of national law schools. Soon after, a handful of law students at Yale, Harvard, and the University of Chicago, sharing their enthusiasm for free market concepts, as they termed it, founded the Federalist Society. And for their faculty advisor, they enlisted a University of Chicago law professor named Antonin Scalia. 5 years later, Scalia ascended to the Supreme Court. Horowitz, by that time, was David Stockman's legal advisor. And the Federalist Society boasted over 2,000 members from 70 national law school chapters. Charles Koch and Richard Scaife Mellon and 2 other right-wing billionaires footed the bills. Less than 2 years into his term on the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia gained intellectual respectability, as Horowitz was suggesting necessary, by creating the judicial theory of originalism. To a degree, we are probably all familiar with originalism, but a clear-eyed analysis reveals its practical effect in law and society. The journalist Kurt Anderson puts it this way: originalism's most important hidden agenda is to keep courts and judges completely out of the business of business, as if what worked for the US economy for its first century, before modern corporations existed, what is how things should work today. It is like the Friedman Doctrine, which turned a reasonable capitalist truism, profits are essential, into a single-minded, unhinged, socially destructive monumania. Only profits matter. As movements, originalism is to the law as libertarianism in economics is where they are fraternal twins. Members of the Federalist Society pledge allegiance to those values. And currently, 6 members of the Supreme Court are members of the Federalist Society. The many tentacles of Charles Koch's influence in those individuals' ascent to the court are public record. And I'm glad to send a small bibliography of titles to anybody who's interested. But I want to move on to another aspect of the Kochtopus, to shed light on the use of the tools of government to undemocratically affect its purpose, that's to say the right wing's purpose. Jane Mayer's graph of Koch-funded 501c3s includes that one I named, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC for short. ALEC is defined in Wikipedia as, quote, a nonprofit organization of conservatives, state legislatures, conservative state legislators, and private sector representatives who draft and share model legislation for distribution among state governments in the United States. Founded in 1973 by Paul Weyrich, director of the Koch Scaife-funded Heritage Foundation, ALEC enables corporations to write model laws that favor those same corporations and pass these laws to legislators who introduce the model laws as bills under their own names. Model laws are fill-in-the-blank forms, as in the legislator puts his name, the state he represents, and the date of introduction of the bill, and just hands it into his chamber. ALEC charges state legislators $50 a year for membership in the organization, and charges corporations a minimum of $5,000 up to $25,000 for membership. But the lion's share of income to the organization of ALEC is through dark money. A completely unabashed article in USA Today in 2018 on ALEC noted that, quote, ALEC had 10.3 million in revenues for 2017, with 8.9 million coming from donations, unquote. Each year, conferences are held in states with Republican-controlled legislatures, and there is at least one national conference. ALEC is the genesis of what are currently called copycat laws. The abortion law in Mississippi is a prime example. 14 other states have introduced the very same law. Voter ID laws are another ALEC creation. So too, the Stand Your Ground law, behind which Trayvon Martin's killer based his defense in 2012. ALEC enables corporations to manipulate cultural wedge issues in the spirit of the Horowitz memo that maintain allegiance to the Republican Party among conservatives or racist segments of the working population. Anti-abortion laws, voter ID laws, and vigilante self-defense laws are central to the Republican playbook and central to the corporations funding the manipulation. One of the most important victories of the Coctopus and ALEC was the Citizens United decision. In 2011, a trove of over 700 ALEC model laws was leaked to the Center for Media and Democracy. You may review those laws in their amazing range if you just go to alecexposed.com. Citizens United was a central component of bills in 2009. Citizens United is still another nonprofit political action committee funded mostly by Charles Koch and founded in 1988. When Citizens United sued the Federal Elections Commission in 2008 for the FEC's prohibition of the airing of an insulting and libelous ad against Hillary Clinton, ALEC generated supportive resolutions in favor of the Citizens United lawsuit. These were introduced in 23 states, as well as to the Supreme Court in an amicus brief. At the same time, other critics of the Citizens United lawsuit identified documents naming Justices Scalia and Thomas as past participants in at least 2 Koch-sponsored conferences. And they carried with that identification appeals for their recusal in the Citizens United case, all of which landed on deaf ears. Citizens United won the case, and American politics have been held captive, held mostly in chains ever since. And I'm going to stop there so that we can have a conversation.
Thank you, Nick. And Tim. Well, we're opening it up for discussion, questions, comments. That was a tremendous amount of information. I so appreciate that you put all of this stuff together in one presentation. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I see one comment, how do ordinary citizens win? There's a real feeling of being overwhelmed, and that's that's the nature that this presentation really, I think, underscores, is that from the Constitution to, to today's ruling on the Alabama gerrymandering, the point of the Supreme Court is to prevent democracy, period. Just period. And it's been extremely successful. And what's, I think, again, it's sort of amazing how long we can live within a fiction that we live in a democratic republic against all the evidence, basically.
And I think the more we talk about what we perceive anyway as the realities of this political economy, that awareness spreads. I know this is the kind of a lockstep kind of answer, a pro forma answer, but I don't have any miracle solutions otherwise. That at least start raising awareness of where the power lies and what the purpose of that power is, in spite of all the grand mythology that's taught to all of our kids and to adults, throughout the ages. So the more we can talk about, more we can expose what we think are the real sources of power and the motive behind that power. I think that's a step in the right direction. And the other, of course, is we'll never give up. To give up means that they have won. They, meaning those who do want to continue to undermine democracy, and so forth. And so we do the many things and many million things we can do to improve our neighborhoods, our world, just around us, is a valid and necessary response to a dystopian circumstance. But not giving up is part of that, and a lot of us here haven't given up.
I always look, as you sometimes chastise me for, I always look for the optimism, and I find that the current journalistic analysis of Trump's admission that he overtly sought to overturn the election using Pence as his tool. And then following up with that, the Republican National Committee characterizing the riot itself on the Capitol as legitimate political discourse. This leaves the Republicans so utterly exposed as who they are, but who they are is what this Supreme Court is also basically, and so the analysis is that how are they going to do it? How are they going to play this book, and maybe it will divide the Republicans and so forth and so on. But it does give those of us who are critics of all of the status quo plenty of ammunition. I mean, just clarion screams. They're against democracy. And so the myth, you play the myth against the enemies of democracy, and that's the Democrats' only hope.
There's another question coming in there. I can't see the whole thing.
Has there ever been an era in the U.S. when the Supreme Court has worked for the public good? Absolutely.
Yes. Certainly when, much to Eisenhower's chagrin, because he appointed Earl Warren to the court. He was a rather conservative governor of California, and but it was under the Warren court from 54 to really, well, he retires in 69, and then a few others retire, such as Douglas retires around that time, and Thurgood Marshall. So in that era, for almost 20 years, was, I think, a profound high watermark of the Supreme Court, and in expanding judicial and economic rights, political rights, and doing what we would expect within a legitimate democracy to do. And that was that's basically, in my view, I can look in the 19th century, I don't see anything, and certainly not in the early 20th century, as I made some references to, but the Warren Court would certainly be the high water mark. And we are feeling right now, as which is typical in American history and probably in every country, is that there's a reaction to any kind of expansion of rights. We get an equal and opposite or more vigorous reaction to that, to those assertions of rights that we saw in the 60s. For instance, if you look at Roe versus Wade, one of the most powerful products of that was that it energized the right wing, the Christian right, to get politically active. And Roe versus Wade was considered to be one of the turning points in the emergence of a very powerful, effective conservative movement that we are reaping the whirlwind of today. And that, Trump himself, in many ways, is not an anomaly, but rather a logical consequence of the gathering forces, effective forces of people that have a different vision of what the world should look like, and are willing to do extraordinary things to achieve those, or attempt to achieve those. And certainly the attack on the Capitol, that treasonous acts, was an extraordinary earmark of that trend. So I would give the Warren Court high marks. Although I love the vicissitudes of history. When Eisenhower was asked when he was retiring, he said, "What's the worst decision you ever made?" And he said, "Appointing that damn Earl Warren to the court." Yeah. So good question.
Here we go. The most interesting suggestion for Supreme Court reform I've heard is to make it a rotating bench where circuit court judges are rotated in and out at shorter staggered intervals. Would this solve any of these more systemic problems that you're discussing?
You want to take that, Nick? I can try it.
Well, I think, I mean, the problem I suspect with, what I see within that question that I would favor would be term limits for court justices. I mean, there's just no legitimacy to life term to begin with. Bringing circuit court judges in and out, I think there is a serious. The Supreme Court's a serious job. I think it takes a while to do it, even if you're a bad guy. It takes a while to be able to, sort of absorb the case history of any particular case. So
particularly if you don't have the experience that you should have to get on the court.
Well, yeah, well and so those justices take even longer to get up to speed. But 18 to 24 months, I think, is a little too short to be circulating judges. But I would have no problem with an 8-year maximum term for a Supreme Court judge. I don't see any problem. That's presidents who are successful are 8-year terms, and it still stays within the realm of political circularity. And I can imagine, and I think that's a concept that might be pretty useful.
Responding to Peter's thoughtful question, one of the things I think that needs to be seriously looked at, and there's certainly been a lot of ink spilled over these in the last few years in terms of reforms. But one of the things that I haven't read much about is that the nomination process is absolutely so politicized. It has to be completely, in my view, has to be completely scrapped. and it should be, it should not be in the hands of one party or another party. That I believe that it should be a bipartisan and as neutral as you possibly can committees, or there could be committees of the legislature, or it could be committee citizens that have been appointed because of their track record for honesty and even-handedness, to become the nomination committee. So you take it out of the hands of the political process as much as you can. All right, but it would be a large step, a difficult step, but I think that would go to a certain extent to improving upon the situation and making it, depoliticizing it. Another idea would be certainly the term limits. I don't know that the rotation I don't think that's a bad idea either. But just taking the notion of entrenched rights out of it in terms of both class and politics, if somehow we can divorce the process from those entrenched rights, or interests, not rights, those entrenched interests would go a good way towards maybe improving on this judicial process. Other comments?
Wasn't there a time when the American Bar Association used to make recommendations on nominees to the Supreme Court?
Yes, and that was the standard. It had been going on since the Bar Association of the 19th century.
Yeah.
That they would make recommendations, but it had its inside politics for sure, but it didn't have millions and millions of dollars in institutions that Nick so ably described behind it and manipulating it. It was a more open and honest process, and as a result, I think the results were more open and honest. But now it is so highly perverted with the Koch machine and the foundations, the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation and so forth, that what we do now is we curate. I mean, they're literally, what's happening now, they're identifying people in law school and starting to cultivate them even in their first years in law school.
Kavanaugh, Gorsuch,
Yeah.
and Comey,
Yep.
3 examples. All 3
Yes.
Immediately.
Yes, and so they were in that milieu really since the early intellectual days, and so they were nurtured by an overarching system that was going to defend certain interests at the expense of others.
So I have a very, very good friend in Ecuador who's listening in, and he's pointing out that voting is obligatory in Ecuador for everybody 18 to 65. And all votes, all ballots have an option for none of the above. But it is mandatory, and you got to show that you came and went to the voting booth. He's asking, is that a change that might change U.S. politics, and is it possible?
I can answer that, but I'd be happy to have other voices chime in as well.
Then go ahead, Tim.
Okay. I don't think mandatory voting is going to help if the system that we have in place now remains. Just getting people to the polls in a system that's already, in my view, been corrupted, and who actually gets to be considered as a candidate is not, that won't change the system. You're just going to still have the same limited choices. I mean, we theoretically have a multi-party system. We don't. I think we have a 2-party monopoly, and they're really they're 2 different wings of the same party. A little, and depending upon the time in history, that sometimes they're farther apart. Like I would say now, in the Trump era, the Republicans are much more distinctly conservative, more so than they've ever been. But the idea of having real choice still isn't there. You know, in a real democracy, we would have, you know, how many parties, you name it, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 that are viable. Like you look at it, and I look at a better system would be the democratic socialist systems in Europe, where they have viable alternative parties that may go from the far left to the far right. And then they have a much more, I hate the term, but level playing ground to be players in the system. Also, it would help to have a proportional representation system. And in my view, a parliamentary system is much more democratic than whatever we have. So those are just a few ideas. So.
You know, and the real fundamental basis is campaign finance reform. I mean, in the European system, it's a state-regulated campaign finance structure, and so Citizens United is the culmination of the attack on the 2002 McCain-Feingold Act, which was the last successful popular effort to put limits on corporate and personal wealth spending on politics. And once those were put in place in 2002, it didn't take but a year and a half before the Supreme Court started eviscerating it and then actually warped it to the worst situation on the other side that the United States has ever seen, which is a testimony to Koch's power and his Koch to puss. But you know, but it still remains the case. If we, as citizens of the United States, really wanted to reform the political system within which we live, it's always about campaign finance reform.
Well,
Thanks
yes.
for hanging in there. I hope that all the names that I'm looking at are actually having been here and have had a useful time on this session.
It's been a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm really, as I said, I'm really impressed by it, by all the information and many facets of the attempts to undermine democracy in this country. It's so great to see it all in one picture. And so I would like to thank you for all of you for being a part of this discussion, and particularly Nick and Tim for putting it together like this. So thanks so much. So just to wrap things up, I wanted to say, as I already said, thanks to everyone for being a part of this. And I also wanted to say that our shows will now be on the Vermont Media Exchange, which means that they will be viewable on all public access TV stations in Vermont and not just on BCTV. So that's really exciting for me. We look forward to seeing you at our next Zoom meeting on Tuesday, March 8th, perhaps, when we'll be taking another look at democracy. Although after we've seen so much tonight, I can't imagine what we'll be talking about. But I wanted to thank Andy Reichsman of Ames Hill Video for tech and Zoom help and for editing the recordings of this meeting. And once again, thanks to WVEW and BCTV. And thanks to everyone for being here, and we'll see you soon.
Cheers.
Yes.